It started as an ordinary Wednesday in London's High Court. But ordinary quickly slipped away the moment Prince Harry entered the courtroom. Imagine this: a prince, stripped of his usual ceremonial shield, standing alone to confront one of Britain's most powerful newspapers. You'd think status would protect him. You'd think a royal name carries weight that stops even the sharpest reporters in their tracks. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And yet, here he was, accusing the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday of something that could sound almost surreal: unlawful information gathering. Fraud, he claimed, disguised as journalism. Now, pause for a second. Think about that. The same papers that have chronicled nearly every move of the royal family for decades, scrutinized every handshake, every smile, every private holiday, were suddenly on the receiving end of scrutiny themselves. Harry, the very figure they've written about, photographed, and dissected, was pointing a finger back at them. And the courtroom? It was quiet, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. He didn't step in with theatrics. He didn't wave a document and shout headlines. He gave testimony, measured, deliberate, and yet, each word carried weight. The allegation wasn't minor. It wasn't a casual grievance about paparazzi snapping photos. This was about private information allegedly obtained or commissioned illegally, stories that invaded lives for decades. And Harry's claim wasn't just about himself. It was about principle, about the idea that nobody, not even a prince, should have their private life sold for headlines under the guise of legitimacy. And then there's the publisher's response, delivered even before the trial started. Preposterous, they said, without foundation. They leaned on history, pointing out that many of the stories were decades old, published with no complaints at the time, framed as responsible journalism, derived from legitimate sources. But if it's all above board, why now? Why the timing? The contradiction itself is almost dizzying. Here's the thing: this trial isn't just a legal formality. It's a slow-moving reveal of power, reputation, and trust. It's Harry's personal confrontation with a media empire that, for years, has shaped his public image. And for the audience, the stakes feel immediate. Every statement, every pause in the courtroom, every exchange between lawyers isn't just procedural. It's loaded with potential consequence. And yet, the schedule itself hints at something more. The trial is set to run for over 2 months, stretching to March 26th, and Judge Matthew Nicklin, presiding, will ultimately deliver a ruling at a later date. But as observers watch the proceedings, one question lingers in the air, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. How far will the judge go? How harsh or shocking will the consequences be? What exactly could unfold that would leave the public gasping? But the courtroom wasn't just watching, it was reacting. And the reaction was subtle at first. A shift in posture, a slight tightening of the judge's jaw, a reporter pausing mid-note. You could feel the energy change the second Harry laid out his claims. It wasn't about shouting or theatrics. It was about the weight behind each word. He wasn't just accusing journalists of doing their job poorly. He was suggesting something far darker: that private lives, carefully shielded, could have been exposed illegally, systematically, for decades. The lawyers on the other side didn't flinch. Not openly, at least. The publisher's counsel leaned back, composed, delivering calm rebuttals with phrases that sounded almost rehearsed. Preposterous and without foundation. Responsible journalism, based on legitimate sources. But you could sense the tension under the surface. Because words are one thing. Proof, timing, and credibility are another. And in a courtroom, those invisible weights matter more than anything. Now, consider the irony here. Harry has spent years in the public eye, his every misstep, every awkward smile, every private moment splashed across papers and tabloids. And now, for the first time, the gaze has shifted. The prince is scrutinizing the media that scrutinized him. The powerful tables have turned, in theory. But in practice, he is alone in the courtroom, facing a decades-old institution that knows exactly how to operate under the radar, how to twist perception without ever breaking a formal rule. And that's where the tension cuts the deepest. There were moments during testimony when Harry paused, collected himself, glanced at the gallery. You could see the calculation behind each word. What to reveal, what to hold back. It's a careful balance, almost chess-like. Every statement risks interpretation, distortion, backlash. And yet, his composure was deliberate, almost daring. The courtroom hung on it. And yet, what complicates the narrative is the question nobody in that room could answer immediately. Even if Harry's evidence is sound, what does it actually prove? Illegal activity? Breaches of privacy? Or simply the murky gray area between aggressive reporting and unethical intrusion? And more importantly, how would a judge, known for measured deliberation, respond to allegations of this magnitude against one of Britain's most entrenched media powers? Observers whispered about subtle exchanges between the legal teams. A slight nod here, a barely perceptible frown there. Every micro-reaction hinted at strategy, tension, anticipation. There was more beneath the surface than anyone could see, and the sense of impending drama was almost tangible. Then, just as the courtroom seemed to settle into a rhythm of careful listening, the judge spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically. But the words, measured and deliberate, carried an undertone that made everyone lean in. Whatever came next, it was clear. The case, the accusations, the media's reputation, even Harry's own standing, it was all about to shift. But what came next would break the calm entirely, and no one could have predicted the intensity of what followed. And then the judge leaned forward, and the air seemed to thicken. Not a dramatic gasp, not a slam of a gavel. Just a pause, a careful silence that carried more weight than any outburst could. How often does a courtroom quiet itself like that? How often do words unspoken feel louder than any testimony? And in that stillness, the underlying question loomed. How far could the law go in holding a media empire accountable? Harry's team had spent weeks preparing, sifting through documents, compiling evidence, strategizing every angle. But even with all the meticulous planning, the atmosphere in that courtroom hinted that the challenge wasn't just legal. It was psychological, reputational, almost elemental. The publisher had decades of history, precedent, and public trust, or at least the kind of institutional inertia that makes organizations almost impervious to individual claims. And yet, here was Harry, standing as a singular force, presenting allegations that could ripple far beyond the walls of the court. The judge, Matthew Nicklin, is known for precision and deliberation, but even he seemed to recognize the gravity in the room. Each question he asked, each slight inflection in his tone, carried layers of implication. And the audience, including reporters, legal observers, and even the occasional curious onlooker, could sense that every pause, every micro-expression was loaded. There was tension in restraint, irony in civility, and suspense in measured scrutiny. Then came the moments that revealed the subtle but ruthless power of legal theater. Harry's counsel raised points about sources, about methods, about motives, carefully weaving together a narrative that wasn't just about privacy, but about ethics, integrity, and accountability. The publisher's team countered with the familiar refrain: responsible journalism, legitimate sourcing, stories decades old. And yet, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. What counts as responsible when personal lives are exposed without consent? When trust is broken, does history justify it? It was in these micro-battles that the real drama unfolded. You could feel the emotional tension rise. Harry, composed but tense, knowing each word could define not only this trial, but his public legacy. The media representatives, calm, professional, but aware that missteps could tip the narrative. And the judge, sitting at the center of it all, an arbiter whose eventual decision could send shockwaves through the media, the monarchy, and public perception alike. And the thing nobody could predict was what happened when the judge hinted, almost casually, that he was not only considering the legal merits, but also the broader implications of the case. The courtroom froze, the journalists' pens paused mid-scribble, and Harry's team exchanged glances that were half hope, half fear. Because this was no longer just a trial about documents and testimony. It was a trial about reputation, precedent, and the very boundaries of power. But just as the tension reached its peak, something unexpected unfolded in that quiet courtroom. A move, a word, a gesture that would alter the trajectory of the case in a way no one, not even Harry himself, could have anticipated. And then the courtroom recessed, but the tension didn't leave. It lingered like smoke. Observers whispered in clusters, lawyers exchanged hushed words, and outside the High Court, reporters scribbled furiously, trying to capture the shifting narrative. What had just happened inside wasn't just testimony. It was the subtle reshaping of a story that had followed Harry for years. And the implications? They were only beginning to surface. Harry stepped out briefly, flanked by his legal team. His expression was calm, almost measured, but there was something in his eyes. A quiet unease, the kind that comes when you realize the stakes are higher than you first imagined. This wasn't about winning or losing a single case. It was about the credibility of a royal, the power of the press, and a legal precedent that could ripple far beyond one courtroom. And while the public might see a prince facing a newspaper, what they didn't see were the subtle calculations, the tensions, and the unanswered questions that would follow him for weeks. The fallout began immediately in quiet ways. Analysts started dissecting Harry's evidence, wondering whether the allegations of illegal activity could be substantiated after decades of reporting. Media insiders speculated about the publisher's internal review processes, the sources they had relied upon, and the possible vulnerabilities in their defenses. And yet, despite all this scrutiny, some things remained intentionally opaque. How much did Harry truly have? How much would the court allow to be revealed? And how far could the judge, deliberate and meticulous, push before the scale tipped in one direction or another? What added to the tension was the contradiction between public perception and courtroom reality. To the outside world, this might have looked like just another legal skirmish between a royal figure and the press. But inside, there were micro-moments that hinted at something far more consequential. Subtle glances, the slight stiffening of posture, the pause before a word was spoken, all signs that something significant was brewing, something that could alter reputations, trust, and power dynamics in ways the media and the public couldn't yet quantify. And then there were the questions that no one wanted to voice aloud but lingered in the background. If Harry's claims were validated, how far would the consequences go? Would there be reparations, public admissions, or even institutional embarrassment for the press? Or, if the claims were dismissed, what would that mean for Harry, for the perception of privacy rights, and for the public's trust in fairness and accountability? The answers weren't clear, and that ambiguity was almost more gripping than any revelation itself. As the day ended, the courtroom doors closed, leaving behind a story suspended between accusation and judgment. The public would wait. The media would speculate. And Harry, he would prepare for the next round, knowing that each moment, each word, each pause could be pivotal. But what the next session would reveal, and how far the judge was willing to go, would leave everyone stunned, reshaping not just the case, but the conversation around privacy, power, and the very definition of accountability in ways nobody had anticipated. And now, as the courtroom drama stretches toward its inevitable resolution, the question that hangs in the air is almost unbearable. What does it all mean? The evidence, the arguments, the pauses, the glances, they've all built to this point, where the stakes aren't just legal, they're profoundly personal. For Harry, it's more than a trial. It's a reckoning with years of intrusion, misrepresentation, and the constant glare of public scrutiny. For the publisher, it's a test of credibility, a balancing act between defending journalistic practices and acknowledging the weight of serious allegations. Think about it. A single ruling could ripple far beyond the walls of the High Court. It could redefine how the media approaches private lives. It could reshape public trust in journalism. It could, in subtle yet seismic ways, affect the royal family's already complicated relationship with the press. And as the judge considers the evidence, as he weighs decades of published material against allegations of illegality, one thing is certain: nothing in this case is simple, and nothing can be taken at face value. There's also an emotional truth here that's difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Harry has been scrutinized, judged, and dissected for years. And now, in this rare public arena, he's challenging a media powerhouse. The irony is almost cruel. The prince, once relentlessly pursued, now pursues accountability. The contradiction is uncomfortable but undeniable. It's a reminder that power, privilege, and public persona don't shield anyone from accountability or from the consequences of a judge's deliberation. And yet, even as we consider the possible outcomes, uncertainty remains. How harsh, or how measured, will the judge be? Will this case quietly resolve behind closed doors, or will it erupt into a judgment that shocks not just the royal family, but the entire country? The answers are unknown, and that ambiguity fuels both fascination and unease. For the audience, for those following every development, it's a reminder that some stories refuse closure, that some trials are as much about tension and perception as they are about law.